Dames en heren, welkom. Ik spreek eerst 2 zinnen Nederlands en daarna gaan we naar het Engels over vanavond. Ik ben heel blij dat u hier gekomen bent vanavond voor een bijzonder gesprek. A program called Into the Writer's Brain. Well, we have a writer here, and I'm sure we're going to pick your brain in many ways tonight. And Dame Antonia Byatt, hardly needs introduction. You know her novels, Possession, the children's book, many stories, but also she's also a critic, and a very wide-ranging critic, writing about literature, and not only English literature, but also European literature. She's written many essays, and she's also written a lot about art, and also sometimes in a form that's mixing the genres in a very interesting way. She is, as you all know, she has been awarded the Erasmusprijs, which I think in the year of Brexit is a very fitting tribute to a very English but also a very European writer. I think that's a nice counter-offense. So welcome. And another guest is a very special guest because he's a neuroscientist, which not a lot of people will associate with literature and art, I think. And I think it's very special that Antonia, as I'm allowed to say, has found an interest in this more scientific way of dealing with what we are, what our sense of pleasure is, what we strive for, and how we are made up. And not only with the eye of the artist, but also from the eye of the scientist. So Morton Kringelbach, he's, and let me say it in English, an associate professor and senior research fellow at Queen's College in Oxford, and also a professor of neuroscience in Aarhus in Denmark. And he's originally Danish, but you would hardly notice because he's also very British, I think. So, and you two know each other quite well. And so the first question is, of course, how did you meet? And maybe another question would be, what aroused your interest in neuroscience and the way it's associated, it interests for an artist like you?
How did we meet?
I think there was champagne there.
I think there was champagne there. I think also we were near the sea in Denmark.
We were in Denmark. We were at a literary festival, and we took to the stage talking about not pleasure but desire. And we'd had a lot of champagne the night before with Peter as well, and a jolly good time, I should say. And we got up. I was slightly worse for wear. And we got up on stage, and Antonia stood up and she said, "I think with my body," which I thought was an extraordinary observation, because of course that's what we do. We think with our minds, and I think Antonia's is a particularly brilliant one, but I think it's important to have the body in there, and then we became fast friends. We've done all sorts of things. We've even been to the Faroe Islands together.
Yes.
And where we did a bit of dancing as well.
Well, some of you did a bit of dancing.
But still, I mean, you two hit it off quite nicely, but there's also the field you're working on, and this immense, land of discovery, you could say, about how our brains work, and a lot of progress has been made during the last decades. So how are you, because you have many interests, but how did you, what was the spark that because when I read your new book, which is a a great essay about two artists that have maybe not, on the first side not a lot together, but the way you write about them, they end up with much more resemblances than you would think. But just to start on the first page, you are describing kind of dreamlike stage that you are thinking. You're in Venice and you are thinking about the light and on the water, and then you get an association, but you describe it as such. I think excuse my English, fancifully perhaps, that the excitement is the excitement of the neurons in the brain, pushing out synapses connecting the web of dendrites, dendrites, two movements, and then there's an illustration, two movements becoming one. So that's a kind of startling image in an essay about two decorating artists. So how did this subject enter your mind?
I think because the more I wrote, the more I got interested in what we have just mentioned, the physical process of writing and thinking. Some writers write for political reasons, and some write to talk about themselves. And I think the reason I write is because when I began to study the English language, which was when I was about 5, when I read this book, which began, Pat can sing, Pat sing to mother, Pat, I thought, this is it. This is what I like. I like written down language. And over many, many years, I've become more and more interested about what it is in my body that so needs to think about the rhythms of written language. And I discovered poetry, as most children of my generation did, quite little. And I loved the rhythms. I love human beings making rhythms as well as grammar out of words. And because I always like to push every thought one step further, I thought, what is it in human beings that likes us not only to do something, but to think about doing it? And so what follows is neuroscience and Morton Kringelbach.
And what did you, apart from having lots of champagne, what did you learn from each other?
So I happen to think that, I mean, everybody talks about how they are a culture of science and there's a culture of art. I've never really believed in that. I believe that there are ways of finding out about things. And I don't believe that there are privileged ways. I mean, there's the scientific method, obviously, but it's not that different from a novelist doing their research, finding out what works in a story. And so I think this is really where we've started meeting, was thinking about making stories. As Antonia just said, there are those who write for political reasons, and Antonia is not one of those, although some of her writing is political, because some of the stories are political in nature. And there are people that write about themselves, and again, I don't think you will find much of Antonia in there, and if it is, it will be by happenstance. Instead, I think what fascinates me, both as a scientist but also as somebody who reads and writes, is exactly what happens in that process of discovery. What is it about these stories and how it is that we think about those stories and what it is that grabs us? As it happens, I can use these scanners to put people in. And of course, much has been made of what happens when you lie in a scanner and you see there's a blob here and there's a blob there and there's a blob everywhere. But that, of course, is neurophrenology. That doesn't tell us anything more about what is really going on. Yet we have now ways of finding out more, and one of the things we've been talking about is what is it really that happens? They're not just blobs, they're webs, as I think Antonia. And I think webs are
a metaphor.
But it's a metaphor that we
discovered very early, or it's a truth as well. There are webs. And one of the glories of meeting Morton and people like Morton, except there aren't any people like Morton, is you realize that what you thought was a metaphor about webs in your brain was the truth. There are complicated webs in there which are working away very well, and that makes me very happy. I don't like things that are just decorative metaphors. I suppose from being very little, I like thinking about thinking, and that's where we come together.
But not just thinking about thinking, but also, I mean, we both have this abhorrence of the word creativity.
Yes.
Now, and it's not because we don't agree that there's something going on, but to call it something as pretentious as creativity, I think we like something like mocking about, to take things that are separate and yet similar.
Yes, that's what you do in Peacock and Vine, actually, with two artists, decorative artists, who are not resembling each other, but it's you who put them together and discover how they...
And in fact, you can read all of Antonia's work in this way. And I think you can read a lot of my science in this way. You take two very interesting things that are seemingly disparate, pain and pleasure, and you find out in ways in which they differ and ways in which they come together.
Yes. Now, the most obvious question would be, have you been scanned already, your brains?
Do I want? No, the answer is no.
Oh.
Or at least, I probably have recently, because I've been in hospital. Probably my brain has been scanned while I was not conscious, and I don't know what the scan said. This
is when you want to know you're fully normal, right?
Okay, yeah.
You've been scanned. I was normal. No, I'm not normal. No.
You don't want to be normal either.
That's right.
Well, there's one Dutch writer who, when he published a novella called Morton Kringelbach, and he had this. When he was writing it, he had this. I don't know what you call patches on his head, of registering his brain activity while he was writing to match up the creativity, if I'm allowed to say the word, in his
Mocking
brain.
about.
And also readers of his novella were put in with skull caps, with all that. So to see which part of the brain would light up when they were reading and what emotions the novella aroused. Is that interesting to you? Or is that... Because traditionally there's a kind of, as you described it, there's a kind of... lots of writers and artists find this neuroscience reductive, in a sense. Like the American writer Marilyn Robinson, she writes essays and she says, you know, what do I care if someone is fearful and you can see which part of the brain lights up? It doesn't explain anything about the nature of the fear, because is it spiders, is it anxiety, whatever. So it's culture that creates meaning, in a sense.
But the biology of the fear is more interesting than a woman describing standing in a kitchen making a soup. I like doing that as well. Any soup is extremely interesting. You could spend 20 pages describing making a soup. But the neuroscience of making the soup, exactly how you know which ingredient makes the taste, why eventually you want this particular taste, why do you want this soup to be salty, why would you rather it didn't taste of aniseed, because I don't like aniseed. I can't understand why she thinks it's reductive. I'm very worried by writers who think that other forms of thought are reductive, because actually autobiographical writing is reductive. Everybody, as you walk through your house and you go up the stairs and you go into the bathroom, unless you're very odd, you are telling yourself as a novel. I mean, maybe other people don't do it, but I say, I came through the front door, and then I look round myself, I say, there was a large patch of mud on the carpet, the housekeeper must get rid of it, the owner of the house must get rid of the mud. I go up the stairs, I say to myself, these stairs are very steep. Halfway up, I will say, it's interesting nowadays I'm more bothered by the steepness of the stairs. By the top of the stairs, I shall be saying, how does my brain register the steepness? I don't think the brain is the least interesting thing in all that.
I think, I mean, so just going back to the reductionism, I completely agree with Antonia that I don't think it's right for people to pass judgment on that. However, on the other side, I do see that a lot of my colleagues are very arrogant. But of course, there's a very interesting, again, talking about two things that you go together very well, and that's arrogance and ignorance. And I think, again, you know, I think a lot of these statements that are being made, and I can see why you would say, why does it say anything about my experience by having a blob? And I completely agree, of course it doesn't. But that's also what is one of the great joys of talking to Antonia, is that we're not talking about blobs. It's not as if there's a sort of a one-way street here. We're talking about webs. We're talking about the way that information flows in the stories. It so also happens that I'm very interested in pleasure, partly because it's fun to do, because you get into all sorts of trouble. But also because this is exactly what is missing in those of us who will suffer from affective disorders. Depression, for instance, is a classic example of where anhedonia, the complete lack of pleasure, will throw you for 7. And so I'm interested in not only just finding out what are the mechanics that makes that happen. So what is the difference in that pleasure cycle we all go through when we want something, when we like something, when we... But I'd like to, and we have ways of manipulate that we can maybe get into later, but one of the most fundamental way of manipulating that is by stories. And of course, as I'm sure you know, there are now theory forms that is about having reading clubs, meeting, talking about stories. And I think part of the reason for when it works is because one of the most fundamental pleasures in life is being with other people telling stories. And if you allow yourself to enjoy that, of course, then you have a way out. You have a way in, maybe even. And I think, again, those are the kinds of things that I think, talking to Antonia, thinking about the kinds of stories, but also the very mechanics. Because, of course, making a story is like being a scientist. I mean, and maybe we can talk about the kinds of tricks or things that Antonia will do. She will take things that are seemingly very different. We can maybe talk about her next novel, which is about surrealism and psychoanalysis after the Great War. Again, you know, I think there's a fertile ground in there, and the way that Antonia approaches that is like a scientist, like I would approach the kind of problems.
So and for you, it's the opposite of reductive. It's an enlargement of your views and of your mind, actually, when you discover this.
Absolutely. I was thinking, as we were just speaking, about Freud and how Freud's science is precisely storytelling. Freud realized, I mean, I now read, and I don't really disagree with a lot of critical articles that say most of his science was nonsense, but his prose was wonderful. And he was a great, great writer, which means he was a great, great observer of the structures of thought and the rhythms of thought and the rhythms of waking and dreaming. And I want to put that into a novel.
Okay. And can you tell me something about the novel? Is it Freud isn't in it himself, or?
I'm afraid he is in it. I've developed a moral anxiety about going into the heads of real other people. I feel it's wrong, which is why I would rather read a history or a biography of, say, Freud, than a novel about Freud's inner life, which, of course, is always a novel about the inner life of the novelist. I mean, the novelist becomes Freud, and a really good novel does both. It does the novelist and it does Freud, and I have no right to object to it. I read them with pleasure. But what was I saying?
It's a nice view, is in the sense that a lot of novelists, but also filmmakers, are not troubled to jump into the heads of existing people, like for instance a film about Margaret Thatcher or something, about her illness also. So is that for you a kind of, do you see it as a taboo, or is it?
I do personally see it as taboo. I think it's insulting. I think it's cruel. And I think it's very likely to be very untruthful, much more untruthful than if somebody writes a novel about Queen Elizabeth I, who has been dead for so long that she is now, and the language in which she was written is available. People are putting films on the British television and plays on the stage about the living royal family.
Yes.
And I find that, and I stress this as a personal view, I find that very offensive. I don't know if it's, I mean, you could tell me if it's historically very offensive. Maybe people always put the current king and queen. There's a moment when Shakespeare, in his play about Henry VIII, who was dead, does bring on Queen Elizabeth. And you feel, as a reader, when I hit this, I felt really anxious. I felt he had a right to write about Richard III, but how did he see Queen Elizabeth, in whose reign he had grown up? And of course, the moment I ask myself, it's very interesting.
But still, so one of the things you do in your books, of course, is that you will take inspiration, draw inspiration from real people, and then you would create these. I mean, to take children's book, I mean, you do take a lot of the things that happen in the Edwardian era, and you do put them in there. So you would say that the difference then is where would you draw the line?
This is going to look like a digression.
Yeah, but we'll come back to the subject. So please digress.
You need always in art, I think, to bring together two things that were separate. And I see metaphor as the nature of art. A great painting isn't just an attempt to reproduce exactly the appearance of a jug or a flower or a city. It is a way of comparing it to another jug or another flower or another city. That's A of my remark. And this time, I'm not going to forget the second bit. When a book of mine begins, it begins with two things I had been thinking about, I think, all the time. Suddenly, I realize they're two sides of the same thing. And you will tell me about this, but I think this is a fundamental human thought process. That is why we have metaphors. We like two things to be the same thing. And in the case of the novel I'm now writing, I was thinking quietly about the surrealists, and I was thinking quietly about Freud. And it sounds very obvious, but it wasn't. I suddenly saw that the Freud novel was the same novel as the surrealist novel, and that the surrealists' invented dreams were the same as the dreams of Freud's patients that Freud was analysing. And it's the moment of coming together.
Yes, but also, of course, both of them were answers to the madness of the First World War, right? I mean, they were both also answers or ways of thinking about those things.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. I mean, so take from my field, pain and pleasure. So when you are having a hand or another limb amputated, you can sometimes develop phantom limb pain in that, and they can be cruciating. Now, you could cut off more of the arm, which is what they did after the First World War, and all that happens is you get a larger phantom limb, so that doesn't really help. You can give people morphine, and that helps for maybe about 8 weeks, and then you are left with the pain and constipation. So I wouldn't recommend that. Now, as it turns out, by trial and error, some of my colleagues have worked out that if you stimulate the hand area in the brain, deep in the brain in a place called the pericaudoctal gray, in part of this web, if you stimulate, you drill a hole and you stimulate in there and you attach a battery, which is the size of a mobile phone, at 20 hertz you can make that pain go away completely. So you have a patient lying on the table, you turn it up to 20 hertz and they go, that's funny, I don't have any more pain. You turn it up to 50 hertz and the pain becomes as unbearable as it was before. Now if you do this, and we sometimes do this, we then turn it up to 90 hertz. So we are stimulating in the same place in the brain and suddenly the pain becomes unbearable. So now here we have exactly, not just a metaphor here, or maybe exactly a metaphor of pain and pleasure being mediated by the same web of brain connections. So I think Antonia is absolutely right. And of course, this is, if you read her novels, you will see that she does this in all of them. In fact, I think this is the magic key if you were so interested. I think, but not only that, I think this is also the magic key to human nature. I think we have these things that are perhaps separate, or you think they're separate, or they pose some kind of conundrum, some kind of paradox. And a lot of great art, a lot of great science comes about because you're interested in reconciling them or finding out how they are really different.
And is that something, it's running through your work, but is it something that you have become more conscious of lately, in the sense that you understand how you are made up more now, that because of the influence of Morton and his work, or is it something you knew all the time when you were writing?
No, I didn't know it all the time. I used to worry because I felt I was an unnatural human being. I felt, and I think a lot of writers particularly, but other artists feel this, I felt I'm not ordinary. I do everything second hand. And I had, as a young woman, I had this myth that I think a lot of my generation had, that it was possible really to live. I mean, that was why we all got so obsessed with sex. That was something you did and you didn't think about it. At least that was D.H. Lawrence's ideal. And we were all brought up on that. I still have no idea how many people there are in the world who do live their lives with the kind of immediacy we used to think you should live your lives with. But I no longer want to. It doesn't matter. And I am very glad that when I come not to feel my arms or to feel my arms too much, Morton will rescue me from my body.
Yes, yes. You can now do all kinds of things with your brain, with arms, machines and things.
I could even make you, I mean, this of course is really interesting, is that we have this feeling that our bodies are very stable in time. And yet all it would take for me would be to put your arm under the table and put say a green rubber hand on top. And if I was stimulating the rubber hand as I was stimulating your hand under the table, you would start to feel that that rubber hand was part of your body.
Yes.
So much so that if I threatened the green rubber hand that you kind of knew was not your green rubber hand, you'd be frightened.
Yes.
Which, of course, I think tells us something quite deeply about the kinds of things that we think that we know, and the kinds of stories that we tell ourselves about things that should be permanent, but of course are not.
Because I got the feeling of reading this book, which is about, as I said, the translation has just been published, but it also feels like you feel quite at home writing about these very different figures who didn't know each other, were in part of different cultures, but you feel kind of it's you that make the connection, and you feel kind of very relaxed in your writing about it. Is that true?
It is true, though. As you spoke, I don't feel it as personally as that. I think the connection exists. If you look for it. They were both visual artists. And then I started, in fact, looking for, well, actually the narrative of the beginning of the story is interesting. I was in Venice, where I had been invited, and they said, the Venetian University said, all we want is for you to write something about something you will see in this country. And then the professor who brought us kept saying, what you would really like to see is the Fortuny Museum. And I said, I have an obsession with glass for reasons that fit onto what we've just been talking about. You see the glass and you see through it. I want to go to the Glass Museum. He said, you want to go to the Fortuny Museum. You really want to go to the Fortuny Museum. So we went to the Fortuny Museum, which is in his house.
As it happened. He is Italian.
He bought, it is his house. He bought the house, and at the time it was full of Venetian hand workers, who he slowly and carefully turned out, and then he turned the house into Fortuny's house. But when I got to it, I saw this is one man's work of art, which is a place to live. And as I crossed the doorstep, I looked at Venice, where there is stone, and there is water, and there is water, and there is stone, but what there is not is grass. And I thought of William Morris, and I thought, he is the same and exactly the opposite. He is an English artist with the same variety, whose house was his work of art. And it had a river, but it was a little tiny English river with little tiny boats and grass everywhere. And the book began with this one metaphorical vision. And then, this is the best bit of writing a novel, I did the work. I read Morris, and I read Morris, and I read Fortuny, and I read Fortuny. And that's the best bit before you have to start constructing the sentences. Then it gets headachy again.
Yes, because I was surprised to read in the announcement that you find, you said, because your work is about pleasure, but it's also about the other side, the anhedonia, you call it, yeah, and that's the hedonia is you have an institute, National Institute Research Center that's called hedonia. But of course, a lot of people strive for hedonia, but don't have it.
So, I mean, I think it's very interesting because this is a word we owe to Aristotle. So he believed that the good life was about hedonia, which is really pleasure. It comes from the sweet taste of honey, hedus, which is the Greek word. And then he had this other thing that I'm really interested in, but I find very difficult to study, namely eudaimonia. The life well lived, the life embedded in values, which of course is all about storytelling. And storytelling, of course, is one of those things that makes you feel what eudaimonia should be like.
Yes.
And as it happens, I'm very interested in music, and I think music carries both the pleasure and the meaning making, and I think by understanding those two things, and it's not as if the good life is just a lot of pleasure. I mean, that is a hedonistic life where you just become obsessed and in the end will just want the pleasures all the time instead of actually like them, where you actually become addicted to things. But in the eudaimonia, you have something more, you have something else, you have moments of pleasure and you have variety of pleasure. And I think it's exactly that kind of variety, and I think that variety comes out in our storytelling as well.
And is writing yourself, you said then when the headache begins, when we start, is writing, what kind, is it, because in the announcement it said that writing is a pleasure for you. I don't think for a lot of writing, it has moments of pleasure like you described, but writing itself can be a source of anxiety, or...
Not writing is a much greater source of anxiety. Not writing is terrifying. And this is something that has changed in my life as I get older. When I was a young woman, I was afraid of writing because I knew I was going to write badly. Now I'm afraid of not finishing things and not writing things and not doing. And in between is the intense pleasure of finding the right word.
Or the right colour, because of course you use colours a lot in your work.
You see, I can't do music.
But you can do colours and rhythm.
Oh, that you describe it, that you can't do music. Do you listen to music?
Half the people here won't believe me, and the other half might understand what I'm talking about. No, I never listen to music. If people put music on in my house, and I can, I turn it off. My poor husband has to listen with earphones. He sits there with earphones. Every now and then I hear this faint, tinny sound when his music gets very loud. But
it's probably Wagner then.
It could well be Wagner. I do love Wagner. And the reason I love Wagner is because it's verbal. I mean, I can get to Wagner because Wagner loved the German language, I think, as much as he loved music. And he wrote the German language, and his rhythms are linguistic rhythms, I mean, as much as musical rhythm. And one of the glorious moments of my life, really, was when I discovered that despite having no music in my soul, I had a good ear for verbal rhythms and a good ear for other languages. So it wasn't that my ear was dead.
Well, it comes out very strongly in possession as well, I think. I mean, there you have a lot of verse in possession. I mean, you really do have a lot of rhythms and...
Yes, it's...
But and so you have this now you said you're afraid of not writing, and but you are writing a novel, and it doesn't sound like a slim a slim novel,
a slim tome,
taking the surrealist and the Freudian.
The psychoanalyst
circles. That looks like a huge canvas.
I also believe you should have I should have not only one plot. There are beautiful novels that are very short, with one character, one plot, and one language or another, beautifully done. And I do write short stories. Sorry, I do tend to talk by telling stories. This is another good story. I had a small baby, and I was trying to write a novel, and I had a most terrible pain, and I went to see a surgeon, and he poked me about, and he said, "You better come into hospital." So I said, "I can't come into hospital until October because I'm writing a novel." So he said, "You will come in next week." And slowly I saw he thought I had a bad cancer and that he needed to take it out. Now, this is a good bit of narrative. I mean, if it wasn't your life or death, it's a good bit of narrative. So I went out onto his front doorstep and I looked at the English streets and the green trees, and I thought, this is terrible being a writer. I thought, I've never seen them like this before. I think I might be dying, and I'm seeing these trees. And so I went on walking, and I started walking towards the London Library, and I bought a newspaper, and I thought, I'd better learn to write short stories, because I shan't have much time left if I'm going to die. I can't write this very long novel. So what am I doing now? I have had my 80th birthday. I am writing a very, very long novel.
And how far are you?
How long is a piece of string?
Yeah.
Thank you. I have written the first section, which is the end of the First World War in a hospital. And now all the people are in Vienna, and Freud is at work, but the surrealists have not yet started.
Oh, I see, I see. And is it, but it sounds like...
The First World War, of course, happened, and that was very surrealist, so it's not quite true to say that it hasn't happened, but the people that call themselves surrealists...
Surrealists haven't, yeah.
No, nobody had invented the word, I guess.
No, I think you're right.
On the other hand, the Viennese have these wonderful parties called Geschnass, where everybody has to go and take a ludicrous object. I mean,
if that's not surrealism
exactly.
in a nutshell.
And everybody turns up with some jar or jug or hairbrush or fork. And then they tell a story about what this fork really is. And it's like a nightmare or surrealism. But it isn't. It's a Viennese game called Geschnass. There, I didn't know that when I started on it all, eh?
No?
Well, it's a question for you, Morton. But I think it's very clear that Antonia has been much influenced by your field of work. Does it work the other way around? In which way have you been influenced by the work of literature, but especially of Antonia's work?
Well, I think, as I was sort of alluding to earlier, I mean, it's all well and good that we can put electrodes into people's brains or, give them electroshock and so on to try to help people. But of course, I think the seeds of our eudaimonia, of our happiness, was really in the kinds of stories that we tell ourselves. And so understanding and trying to work out what it is about those stories that makes them powerful and make them useful, not just as stories, but also as therapy, if there is such a thing. But I think that really is what stories does for us. I think that has influenced me hugely. I think the other thing I very much appreciate with Antonia is that you can talk about almost anything. And she will have and I think this is one of the key issues, and one of the key things that attracts me in another person is curiosity. There's nothing, and you'll find this in most of your novels, there's nothing that you haven't in some sense already thought about or half, I mean, Thoreau talks about the things that we sort of half know. And I think a lot of the kinds of things is about that exploration, about finding out what it is that we half know, and then exploring those things together. So have I made any great discoveries because of our conversations? Probably. But it's sort of like a dream state in that sense, you never quite know where these things are coming from. But I think the exciting bit, and this is why we were talking about the pleasure of writing, which of course also you do as a scientist, or when you get up good ideas, is exactly the pleasure of exploration. It's a thinking not just with your mind, but thinking with your body, thinking in time. The other thing that I think has influenced me enormously is time. Both the subjectively experienced time, à la Bergson, or time as it really is.
So is it also, and a more general question, is that, people are generally complaining about that literature is slowly edged out of society, the importance of literature nowadays. People are complaining that literature doesn't matter as much as it used to. Writers are not, well, they get enormous interesting prizes, but they are not as, seen as the figures of yesteryear, as a kind of prophet, like you mentioned, Lawrence. That's, the cultural place of literature is diminishing but with your research, the whole sense of storytelling well, let's use the word of creating your own world and balancing your own world with stories and counter stories it seems to be very essential to culture.
But I think not only culture, I think it's human nature. I think it'd be very difficult for a linguistic ape like we are not to tell ourselves these stories all the time. I think one of the interesting things, and of course this is a theme when you think about psychoanalysis, when you think about those, and if you think about surrealism, about the forces that are at play with us. Earlier, Antonia mentioned sex, which of course is a huge pleasure, and yet is one of those things that drives us to madness. A lot of great novels and plays are written about sex, and so a lot of the times we tell ourselves stories, but those stories are not necessarily what is really going on. And I'm very interested in that schism between the stories we tell ourselves, or desperately try to tell ourselves, and the things that are really going on. Because of course this is what pleasure does for us. It makes us react in certain ways that tells us about who we really are. And so in many ways I think this is really what science and art is doing together, is a coming together of understanding the motives of why it is that we do what we do.
But in a kind of open-minded way.
In an open-minded, and I think that's the open-minded exploration that I think is very important to keep. And I think when one side is calling the other for reductionist, and there's arrogance on both sides. And I think that's not really very helpful. And one of the great things about having these discussions, these dialogues, is exactly that, is an open-mindedness. So, take an example. Some time ago, I was accused by the Times, the August English newspaper, of having invented an orgasmatron. So I had written a book called The Pleasure Center, a pink book, and I had written an article in Scientific American about deep brain stimulation. So this journalist, John Harlow, decided that I must have invented a sex chip that could give people orgasms on demand. Which, and so whenever I go to conferences now, people ask me, so Morton, that sex chip, could I? And when I say to them, I don't work on that, they say, I understand you can't talk about it right now. But of course, you take somebody then like William Reich, who of course invented the organ box. He was a surrealist, really, rather than a psychoanalyst. And again, I tell this story to Antonia, and she tells me the story of Marie Bonaparte. And I don't know whether you want to share the story of this wonderful woman and the things she was able to do to herself.
For Marie Bonaparte. Marie Bonaparte was a great woman and a psychoanalyst, and I shouldn't praise her for this first, but she rescued Freud in the Second World War. She got him on a train, and she told the Germans they had to let him out, and she paid to get him to England. But she found she could take no pleasure in sex, or she couldn't have an orgasm. And she assumed, poor woman, that it was because her clitoris was in the wrong place. So she kept having operations to move it. Now, any woman will immediately know if you go doing operations on your clitoris, even if it would have experienced bliss, it is much less likely to do so. And she was moving it on the wrong principle, and she was so intelligent. This was a very sad thing.
So why was she telling herself these stories, I think, is the question here, right? I mean, so she may have heard from Freud that you could only get orgasm through vaginal intercourse, which of course was wrong. We now know that that's not how it works.
I don't think she heard it from him.
No, I don't think she did, because why would she then move the clitoris, which of course is where things...
It was earlier.
Yeah.
I'm slightly lost, but I think I get the point.
You're a man.
But I would like to know, how did she end up? Did it become all right or not?
No.
No.
This is why I made that chip for her. No.
She fell in love with, I'm going to forget now, one of the French presidents. And she wrote some wonderful books. But the British, everybody thinks, because she was so rich, aristocratic, Bonaparte, she couldn't have been serious. And also, she didn't get on with Lacan. We won't go towards, please, let us not go towards Lacan. But,
no.
Can I ask a question? Of both of you. during this conversation, I started thinking about dreams. Dreams are stories. We all sleep and we dream. Every now and then, but very rarely, I think we finish a story. Mm-hmm. But mostly we don't. Why does the brain not just stop? You may know the answer when we go to sleep. What? I mean, Freud thought he knew why we needed dreams. We needed the things at night that we had suppressed in the daytime. But I think it's more complicated than that.
So, I mean, I think the evidence is modeled. John Allan Hobson, who's one of the great sleep researchers of this century, who worked in Harvard for many years, was never funded by any funding agency to study dreams, although this was what he really, really wanted to understand. He nevertheless kept a dream diary, and he told me, I think last year, that in those dreams, 2/3 of them were really horrible, nightmare-inducing things, and then there was about 1/3 that was really pleasurable, and it was usually about sex. Urs van Someren, who is a great researcher from this country, has studied a lot on insomnia, and his opinion on this, and he's done a lot of work, and again, he's never been funded to study dreams, but he thinks that what happens in dreams is essentially just a byproduct of the day gone by. That, in fact, as you increase the insomnia, you have much more likelihood of having these things, but that they are essentially meaningless. Now, I don't think anybody really knows. I think a lot of great art has come out of trying to interpret things that are seemingly meaningless or very meaningful. And I think we shouldn't stop. I think we should very much listen to what it is that our brains are telling us that it's running wild.
Do you write down your dreams?
I write down, I'm trying to remember, as I get older, I forget who said things. Somebody had the idea of the great dream. I think it was Jung, as opposed to just the dreams you have every night. Every now and then you have a great dream, which is a dream like a really complicated poem, which carries more meaning than... And I write those down. I've had 5 or 6, and they do have memorable imagery, which is more like reading a really good poem. And
what about colours? Do they have colours? Like, I mean, because of course colours is something that...
The last one I had, which is a bit ago, had...
Well, the great dreams as opposed to
yes,
the normal dreams.
It had a lot of stone. It had stone caverns with stones in it. And it had a lot of grass of varying greens.
And what about when you were unconscious? Do you remember anything of those dreams?
Recently.
We haven't spoken about this, but I've been very curious about this.
Not much.
No?
In fact, one of the things, life is full of strange pleasures. One of the things I really like about general anesthetics is that you are unconscious. There is nothing in your head. A person comes along and sticks a needle in your hand, and you aren't there. This is wonderful. You can stop worrying until you wake up. Whereas last night, having gone to a most wonderful museum with, among other things, Egyptian things in it, I managed to dream a kind of truncated Egyptian statue which stopped about here, and I kept. It's one of these narratives with no end. I kept walking and walking, and every now and then this damn thing would appear again. It had no skin, but it wasn't exactly fleshy. It was a sort of dark colour. It was a dark orange, except the moment I say that, it's wrong. It's a dark brownish, reddish orange with lines in it that weren't veins. And the moment I start describing it, I'm also destroying it. But I don't ever want to see it again.
Again, no, I can understand. It must have been the hotel.
But there's an
you're
interesting
staying.
thing here, isn't it? And once you start introspecting into these things, they seem to sort of disappear or change into something else. The classic example when it comes to happiness, of course, is the song, "If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands." And the moment you do that, the happiness goes out the window. Right?
That's true.
So don't do that at home.
But that is but because I won't ask you to tell the general dreams. But since you are such a good critic, you must have an inkling of what these general dreams tell you about yourself. Or is this a wrong question?
No, it's a good question. I mean, it is the question. I think because, as I have been saying, I at least think that metaphor is the fundamental thing about the way I see the world. What is wonderful is connecting one thing to another thing. This is just as true of science as it is of writing, which is two things you thought were separate turn out to be two sides of the same coin. And the same is true of a good dream. What did you ask?
No, that's what these dreams tell you. Well, I think you answered the question. It's the way your mind works. But and you also think it's also, you write this in the book, that you are when as you grow older, you're seeing much more the artist and his work as a whole. And I think with this book, which is about two decorative artists, but it's also very much about yourself, about your English rootedness in nature, I think, with Morris, and also this, could I say, this hunger for making art out of art, you know, of this constant alchemy of past artifacts that are turned by fortuny into new kind of arts. I think that these are two sides of your own, well, excuse me, creativity in a sense.
Yes, you find yourself, yeah, by going away from yourself. I mean, I find out who I am by not doing introspection, but by doing research. That's what it is. And I do research on Fortuny, who has nothing to do with me. He's an aristocrat, and I'm a commoner. He lived in Venice, and he had asthma, which I did, and I recognized that. And he liked to live in Venice because his mother said there was no grass and no horse mess in the streets to make him ill. And I recognized that, but that's trivial.
But you like to observe more. In Freudian terms, you're much more a voyeur than an exhibitionist.
I hope so.
Well, I think
I morally believe you should be.
I think it is time to let you take the floor and ask your questions about. You can make it more general about your work. So please, is there anyone who feels? I think there's the mic in the back. So is there anyone who wants to ask a question or make a remark and make it sound like a question? Go a bit high in the end. No? There must be some. Yeah, I think there's a question. Just the first.
Thank you so much for the lecture. I had a question about the suffering of a writer. And it goes back to also, you mentioned, Demontonia, how as a young woman you had a different struggle actually trying to write than now. And what would your advice be to young writers if we're, for instance, thinking about anyone with the writer's block or the suffering? And I would be curious to hear your responses to that. Thank
you. When you say the suffering of the writer, you mean the suffering actually caused by the writing?
Or the not writing.
That too. I think, in my case at least, the suffering was two kinds of guilt. I was brought up by the Quakers. One of the things about the Quakers was that they thought that, the early Quakers thought that art was wicked. So, although I grew up in a house full of books, I didn't grow up with the idea that the greatest thing in life was to be a writer. I really thought the greatest thing in life was to be a nurse. So when I sat and wrote, I thought I should be learning to be a nurse or helping somebody. And if I tried to help somebody, they didn't like it. I mean, it's much better if I don't help you. I'm not very good at it. So there was that kind of suffering. And then, of course, there is the fear that you're doing the wrong thing, that you can't do it. And the fact that you must do it, that, in fact, pick up a pen and pick up some lined paper and I am a different human being. I didn't know that when I was younger. And also, I felt the other girls at school would have liked me much more if I wanted to play netball or even talk endlessly about friendships. I didn't get it right. And then there comes a wonderful moment when you have published a book and people are quite pleased and they seem to think you have got it right, and you travel, and here are all these people who are interested in the writing, and it's wonderful. So there is a kind of moment when it gets better. The other thing I would add, which is part of the question, is I learned only slowly that you need order and rhythm. You need to work every day. You need a big notebook, and if you've not got anything to write, you write nothing. And I read so much, at least I write down, you know, I noticed today in Freud that he describes. And when I reread it, I suddenly realize why I wrote that bit down. So I have a kind of rhythm. But all this takes time to learn. And thank God, I shall never get back to that dreadful emptiness of not knowing what to do next or how to do it.
It's the same process being a scientist. It's very much about doing things all the time and having a structure to it. I remember we talked about this and you said, you know, the way to really tell whether somebody's a writer is whether they talk endlessly about their writing or not. Real writers don't really talk about the writing because that just happens. It has to happen at a certain time, and then, you know, you do the rest of your life. As a scientist, of course, we also do that. Maybe we're a bit more obsessive so that we work all the time, but then...
But you don't go about talking about being a scientist.
No.
You talk about science.
Yeah.
I don't think you have ever been bored in your life.
No. I've been so ill that it was like being bored because I couldn't do anything.
But not when you were healthy and...
Actually, that's not quite true. I remember, I wasn't bored, but I remember when I had two very small children, sort of a year apart, if that. And I was so tired. I thought, this is the end. You know, I can't, I'm just too tired to go on. And then I thought, either you get interested in everything or you give up. And my first idea about that was whether or not you're interested, you should read every page of the newspaper. So I started reading every page of the newspaper. I've just decided I no longer have enough life left to read every page of the... So I'm trying now not to read every page of the news. I'm learning to skip the newspaper. It's a new skill. It worked.
Yeah. Another question. Yeah, that's another question.
That's all right, I'll just shout it out. It's a question for Morton first, really, which is, oh, thank you very much. I was interested in, Bas was talking about Morton Kringelbach, was it, who did the gimmick, I think I'm going to call it, with the sensors on his head. But to what extent do you think the experience of reading, let's say, a passage in a novel about a very intense pain, the experience of pain, as a reader, is there any connection in the neurological experience of reading about that to the actual event itself? Is there any way of experimenting to determine this question? Are you interested in that question?
So I'm very interested in it, together with another writer, Roman Krasnarek, who is also a philosopher. He has written a book on empathy, and initially the subtitle was A Guidebook to Revolution, but as it happens, his publisher thought it was a bit too radical. But what was even more radical was that he set up a thing called the Empathy Museum, which is it's an experiential space. We've done a number of installations, and one of them is where you come into a shoe shop, and you can choose any pair of shoes, but if you choose, say, these wonderful shoes, then you get also a set of headphones, and you will now listen to the story of the owner of those shoes. She will tell you about what her colors, what that means to her writing, or what it was like to be a Syrian refugee, or what it's like to be, a Trump supporter. Any of those kind of very disparate kind of things that causes us to feel empathy, maybe even compassion for those that we cannot identify with. And of course, I just mentioned one of those. And I think that experience of having empathy, I think this is really what the novel gives us. I think this idea of actually, it's my only chance really of being a woman, is to read the narrative of somebody who really, and I must say, my mother was a librarian, so I practically grew up in a place like this. I started with the children's book, and then I worked my way through and initially I didn't understand much of the adult literature, but slowly I started to understand what it was like to be another person. And I think this is what great literature does to us. It allows us to experience even vicariously, but I think we are so good, as I mentioned earlier, to make these virtual worlds just from the narrative. And I think it's one of those gifts. I think it's stories that brings us an understanding of who we are or who we could be.
Maybe a last question. Yeah, that.
You want to keep the mic. Okay, thanks very much. It's a fairly open question, really. I went last week to listen to a very interesting young writer called Sadie Smith, and I just wondered what you like reading of the new generation of writers coming up, both of you. What enjoys you, and what do you enjoy, and what inspires you, and what do you think is sort of hopeful for the future in the sense of empathy moving forwards?
Do you read new writers, or I can also see, because you do so much research, that you are more focusing on what you need actually for your own work than just reading wildly new novels.
I like to follow new writers once I get to know that I'm interested in them. Mm-hmm. I'm interested at the moment in sort of 3 young writers writing in Britain. Mm-hmm. They're not as young as they were.
Who is, but yeah.
Who is. But one of them is Adam Thirlwell, who I think has invented various new forms of how to tell stories. He annoys a lot of people because he understands how to annoy people. And I really like his work. I like the way, I think he has invented a new way of writing the English language, which is still both in the tradition of the novel as it was and very much new. I like a completely opposite writer called Lawrence Norfolk, who writes novels so long. I think writers should never give advice to other writers, but I do want to say to him, hurry up, please write a bit faster. Instead of which he nobly brings up his children, and he's writing a very long novel about Elizabeth I, which he does seem to be coming to the end of. And he has published 3 or 4 very long novels, which are wonderful. And the third writer I like, whom I've discovered much more recently, is Patrick Flannery, who in fact is an American, and again is inventing new forms. I don't like people who say, I am an experimental writer. It's rather like saying I am creative, which is a word one never must ever use. But
it's not available.
Inventive writers is a word I like. I like people who have to think of a new way of writing sentences or paragraphs because they have things to say, which might be only about writing, that haven't quite been said before. And I don't read as much as I did, but what I read that does that makes me very happy.
Yes. So and for you, there's no sense of literature disappearing or being edged out of culture?
Yes, there is.
There is.
It's being edged out very fast. I know you don't agree with me. Huh?
I don't think stories will disappear. I think certain ways of telling those stories.
Stories won't.
No, I don't think they will.
But what we call literature, I think, will. I shan't be here. I shall have had my injection in the back of my hand and I won't be there to see it. But I was thinking as we were driving here this evening, the world has changed so fast. The cars, the roads, the lights. None of it was here when I was young. When my grandparents were young, there were things that hadn't been there, but not like this. And somebody gets, most of the time, most people get out their telephones and they look at stories. And the stories mostly are images, not words. And this is the world most people live in. And the great artists to come, I think, will know how to turn this banal activity into art. I shan't.
I think it's also very important to remember that there's a world outside the English language. I tend to be very excited by people like Marie Ndiaye, who is a fantastic French writer, and I'm not sure whether she's translated into Dutch. She may be.
Who
Marie Ndiaye, her name is.
Yeah, she's translated, I think, by the Geus.
She's difficult to read in French. I'm not sure how well she's translated in English. She works.
Yes.
Well,
she started I think she was 16 when she wrote her first novel, but she's translated.
She was plucked out of obscurity. I know. I mean, I think there's some interesting American writers as well. Lately, I was very much taken. Although it's not really a novel, but it's a storytelling. I was taken by Barbarian Days by William Finnegan, sorry. Extraordinary book. And I think, so for me, and I think this is one of the things, I think the novel does a lot of things, but I think there's a lot of things where you can make one thing become another, where you can merge these things. And I think this thing that we call reality, this idea that we have to invent things, I think I'm very hopeful for the stories of the future of stories.
The future of stories, yes. The future of the novel, as I used to teach it at university, no. I am not the last generation that will love the work of George Eliot and Dostoevsky, and my children are not the last generation, and their children aren't, but I think it's going.
But let's just think about this for a moment, though, because I was thinking this as we came here on the bus as well. You were describing how you came to Oxford, and you were surprised, having come from Cambridge. As one of my friends would say, you know, I would go to Cambridge first to avoid the disappointment. But that's another story. But you were telling me how it was when you first came up, and you said all the people there, they were not interested in the novel as I was interested in them. So
they hadn't read any novels. So they stopped in the beginning of the 17th century.
So you see, I think what happened to those in those days, they said, well, you know, there are no stories left. And I think it's very difficult to call the end of anything, especially when life is cyclical like this. And I think one of the things that we discussed this as well, I think one of the reasons why there are not many people writing like Antonia in the English language now is because she is so monumental. I mean, if you were to write like her, you would become a simile. You wouldn't become a metaphor. You would become somebody. It's too difficult at this point. It doesn't mean, you know, at some point that there won't be other people trying that style out. I think it's just there are niches like in biology, and those niches are being filled. And I think as we come through, we will discover new niches, and there will be some that then become vacant again. And I'm hopeful. Even though with, you know...
You seem, well, I mean, we won't... Then let's make it more uplifting. Your own work is that you... When I remember when Possession appeared, and when it got the Booker Prize, but now I see it published in Everyman's Classic Library, so you've written a classic. How does that feel, that you see your work and you're a dame? How do you see your work? Because you seem to be someone who's too busy and too active and too energetic to bother about these things too much, because you're always busy with something that comes up. But how do you see your own work? How do you value your own work, looking back?
I'm very glad it's there. You know, I was afraid I wouldn't write it. And I don't think about it a lot. I think about the next book and what shape it will be and how it will be different from anything else and how to do it. I'm extraordinarily surprised to be so successful. I remember when I wrote Possession, a very high-powered publisher said to me, this was before it came out, he said, would I like to move to his publishing house from where I was? So I talked to my agent, and I didn't really. I said, no, I'm perfectly happy where I am. And he said to me, I've been told this isn't really quite the kind of thing that people are really going to want. We'll wait and see what you do next. So that was on the whole how I saw myself, you know, wait and see what I do next. It is the Quakerism which is very useful. It seemed to me if you want success, as opposed to wanting to work well, you're in a mess. Yeah?
But it's the work, isn't it? I mean, we talked about this. I think it's the work, and I think it's the work that defines us, but it's also what, it may be painful during the dissertation, but there is a flow there. There is a eudaimonia, I think, as you create it, whether be it art, be it novels, be it stories, be it the stories that we tell ourselves about science. And I think that really is what defines us, is what we do.
So you mostly don't look back, but when you look back, you're slightly satisfied.
Yes.
Thank you.
Slightly satisfied is a beautiful phrase.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. There are books to be sold. The translation of this wonderful essay is also there, and the English version too, I think. And Morton's book is there, so please stay a little while and drink. And I don't know if you sign some books, but maybe if you ask friendly, you can have an autograph in it. Thank you very much.